8 years old, holding his dead father's hammer in both fists. 12 years old, skipping her own meals so her brother could eat. 5 years old and shrinking every day. 3 children, one mother. 6 weeks before they lose everything. And then a stranger arrived in the snow, broken, bleeding, and hiding a secret that could save them all, or destroy the little they had left. On this channel, we honor the West teaching that rarely gets told, the love between a mother and her children, the kindness between strangers, and the quiet courage that never makes it into history books. The lesson: the people holding the hardest things together are usually the ones nobody's checking on. See them, be like them. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it. Like, comment, subscribe, and ride with us for every story we tell.
The man collapsed face down just 10 feet from her porch. Ellie coughed behind the door, that terrible wet sound that scared Clara more than anything. She lowered the gun and stepped into the biting cold. In 30 steps, the snow was up to her knees, the wind cutting through her dress like it was nothing. The shotgun felt like ice in her bare hands. He was face down, no coat, just a shirt frozen stiff with blood on his left side. She nudged his boot. Nothing. She kicked it a little harder. Missed her. A faint movement in his back. She knelt and rolled him over. His face was gray, his lips blue, with ice in his beard. His eyes fluttered open, brown but empty. "Get up," Clara said. "I am not about to carry you." His mouth worked, but no sound came out. "I said get up. If you die here, I have to dig a grave in frozen ground, and I just do not have the strength for it." A flicker of life returned to his eyes. He managed to get a hand underneath him, pushed, and fell. He tried again, making it to his knees, where he swayed. Clara jammed her shoulder under his arm, and his weight nearly sent her to the ground. He was a big man, heavy as a fallen horse. She locked her knees and pulled. After 10 steps, her back was screaming. At 20 steps, her boots slid on the ice, and they both fell sideways. She grabbed the porch post, her fingernails scraping against the frozen wood. The door swung open. Hannah stood there, all of 12 years old, with a hard look on her face. "Mama?" "No." "Grab his other arm. What if he is one of Hardgrove's men? Hannah Grace, you do it now." Hannah's jaw tightened, but she grabbed his arm. Together they hauled him inside, his body hitting the floorboards like a sack of feed. Clara bolted the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking so bad she had to set the shotgun against the wall. 8-year-old Sam stood by the bed, gripping his father's hammer with both hands, ready to swing. His eyes were fixed on the stranger. "Put that down, Sam." "No, ma'am." Clara saw the way he planted his feet, just like his daddy used to when a coyote got near the chickens, and her throat tightened up. "Fine," she said. "Keep it. Just stay by your sister." From the bed, 5-year-old Ellie let out a deep, rattling cough. It was the kind of sickness Clara couldn't fix with old remedies or prayers. The stranger lay on the floor, his breathing shallow. A dark stain of blood was slowly spreading across the wood where he lay. "He is bleeding pretty bad," Hannah said, her voice flat. Clara knelt and lifted his shirt. A ragged gash, maybe 6 inches long, was torn deep into his side. It looked like he got caught on something sharp, not cut with a knife. The skin around it felt hot, even though the rest of him was like ice. She looked at Hannah. "Get me some cloth strips from the mending basket, and the pot of water. We are wasting water on him." "That water is for Ellie's tea," Hannah said. "I will melt more snow for Ellie. Now go." As Hannah left, Clara pressed her hand against the wound. The man's body jerked and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes flew open. Clara didn't even flinch. She just looked him square in the eye. "Let go of my arm." His grip stayed tight, his eyes wild and lost. "Mister, you are in my house. My children are right here watching. You let go of me right now." His gaze finally focused on hers, and the wildness in them faded. His fingers uncurled and his hand dropped to the floor. "Sorry," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "Sorry, ma'am. Don't you call me ma'am. I'm not old enough for that." "What should I call you then?" "Clara." "Clara." he repeated, closing his eyes. I am Eli. Eli what? Silence. You got a last name, or did you lose it out there in the snow? Just Eli. A man hiding his name was hiding other things too. Clara knew all about hiding. The debt notice for $85 from the banker was hidden in her drawer, a loan from her husband she never knew existed. Hannah returned with the cloth and the pot of warm water. Clara cleaned the wound and bound it tight with strips she tore from her own petticoat. Eli never made a sound. I never made a... He just stared at the ceiling, his jaw clamped shut. A man that used to pain was either a comfort or a terror. You will live, she told him. That wound is ugly, but it is not deep enough to kill you. Much obliged. Do not thank me yet. This storm could go on for 3 more days. I have 2 logs left for the fire, a little bit of flour, and 3 children I can barely feed. You are just one more mouth. He turned his head and looked at her, his expression unreadable. I will not eat your food. Oh, you will, or you will die on my floor, and I already told you I am not digging any graves. A faint smile touched his lips. From the bed, Ellie coughed again, a long, shaking rattle. Your little girl, Eli said, his eyes on the bed. How long has she been sick? 3 weeks. It gets worse every day. Did you try willow bark? I used the last of it a week ago. He fell silent, his gaze fixed on Ellie. There is a creek south of here with willows growing all along it, he said quietly. About a 1/4 mile from here. How could you know that? He did not answer. Clara went to the shelf and took down the bread tin. Inside was one hard 3-day-old piece of bread. She broke it into 4 pieces. 3 larger ones went to the children. Sam took his, broke off a tiny piece, and gave it to Ellie. The smallest piece remained in Clara's palm. Eli watched her from the floor, his eyes following the bread like it was his last hope. Do not, he said. That is yours. I know whose it is. She placed the bread on the shelf just above his head, then turned her back and went to the stove. She did not need to see if he took it. A long silence followed. Then she heard the quiet sound of hard bread being broken, chewed slowly and carefully. The fire popped, and one of the last 2 logs shifted. The winter night fell suddenly like a lantern being blown out. The wind, which had quieted, returned with a new fury, making the cabin walls groan. Clara checked the bolt on the door twice. She sat on the floor by the stove, her back to the wall where she could see the whole room. Eli was awake. She could tell from his breathing. You should get some sleep, she said into the darkness. Can't. Pain? No, just thinking. About what? About a woman who points a shotgun at a man 1 minute and drags him inside the next. Do not make it out to be more than it was. I would have done the same for a stray dog. No, you would not have, he said. Clara looked across the room. The firelight caught the side of his face, highlighting the old scar through his eyebrow and the hard line of his jaw. You do not know me, she said. I know you split your last piece of bread 4 ways and kept none for yourself. You were counting. I count things, he said. The fire hissed in the silence. And from the bed, Ellie coughed. That little girl needs a doctor. Eli's voice cut through the quiet. The doctor was 12 miles off in town with all the roads snowed in tight. My horse is gone, Clara said, her voice hard. I sold him back in October after Mr. Harrove hiked the taxes on my land. $42 due January the 15th. The horse brought me 20. How much have you got saved up, he asked. That is not your business. No, ma'am, it is not. In the quiet, she told him anyway. $18. She told him about the 2 years of saving every penny, and about the $85 banknote her husband left behind that she never even knew existed. $127 owed, and she had just 18 to her name. This Harrove fella, Eli said. He is the one buying up all the land around here, is not he? Clara was shocked. How could you know that? I passed 2 empty homesteads on my way here, he explained. Good places, fences still standing. Folks do not just walk away from good land. Not unless they get pushed. She stared at this man, half dead an hour ago, yet sharp enough to read the story of the land through a blizzard. "Who are you?" she asked again. "I told you, Eli. That is not what I'm getting at." "I know what you are asking," he said, "but I am not ready to tell you. You are on my floor," she said, "wearing bandages from my petticoat, and eating bread my children should have had." "I know that," he replied. "Then you owe me an answer." "I do," he agreed, "but not tonight." The fire burned low as they both lay awake in the dark, each carrying a heavy burden. Clara thought of the tax notice. January 15th. $42 she did not have, plus 85 more she could not even imagine paying. She pictured Harrove at church, smiling at her like a man admiring something he had already bought and paid for. Her mind drifted to her husband, Jim, how she had found him at the bottom of the old mine shaft, frozen solid after she had searched for 3 days. She had pulled him out and buried him herself, her children watching from the porch. Now a stranger was on her floor, another soul taking what little she had left to give. As the cabin grew cold, she wondered if she was a fool for always spending what she did not have on people who might not deserve her kindness. Just before the sun came up, a sound woke her. Eli was sitting with his back to her, looking at something in his hands. In the last glow from the coals, she saw it, a heavy engraved gold watch, the kind of watch that was worth more than her land and everything on it. Her breath caught in her throat. She shut her eyes tight, her heart pounding, pretending to be asleep as he tucked it back inside his shirt. A drifter did not carry a watch like that. A poor man did not carry a watch like that. All her thoughts circled around one question. Who was this man, and what was someone with that kind of money doing crawling through a blizzard to her door? She did not sleep again. She just lay there, the image of that gold watch burning in her mind. He was not who he said he was. As gray morning light filled the room, she watched him, full of suspicion. He was already awake, sitting against the wall, watching her. He stood up slowly, stiff from the cold and his wound. He walked quietly to the stove and saw the last 2 logs stacked beside it. Clara watched him understand what that meant for her and her children. He did not touch them. Instead, he unbolted the door and stepped out into the biting wind, pulling the door shut behind him to keep the last bit of warmth inside. "Where is he going?" Hannah whispered. "I do not know," Clara said. She went to the window and saw him limping toward the woods, one arm pressed to his side as the snow fell around him. He was gathering firewood. He broke off dead, dry branches, made a pile on the porch, and went back for more. When he came back inside, soaked and shivering, he carried enough wood to last 2 days. He got a new fire going, and warmth finally pushed back the cold. But the heat only seemed to make little Ellie's fever worse. The child was burning up in her arms. Eli saw it right away. "How bad is she?" he asked. "The fever is way up," Clara told him. He stood. "I'm going to the creek for some willow bark. The storm is letting up for a few hours. I can tell by the wind." Clara stared at him. "How in the world do you know that?" "I have spent 20 years reading the weather," was all he would say. He pulled on his boots. "I will be back in 2 hours. If I am not, you stay put and keep that fire hot. You will bleed out walking through that snow," she said. "Probably not," he answered, and then walked out the door. "He is crazy," Hannah said. "Nobody walks in a blizzard for some bark." Young Sam came to his mother's side, holding his father's hammer. Should I go help him? Daddy would have gone. Clara's heart ached as she knelt and hugged him. "No, baby. Your daddy would have told you to stay right here and protect your sisters. That is your job." Sam nodded with a serious look and went to sit by Ellie's bed, the hammer across his lap, standing guard just like his father would have taught him. Clara tried feeding Ellie, but most of it just came right back up. The little girl's cough had turned ugly overnight, changing from something wet to a deep, hollow sound. It was the sound of a sickness that had found a home and was fixing to stay. At the table, Hannah was mending a sock, her hands moving with a quick, angry energy, like she was punishing the wool. "Mama, that man is not what he seems." Clara looked at her daughter. "He has not said much of anything." Exactly, Hannah said, biting off the thread. A true drifter talks your ear off. He tells you where he is from and where he is headed. He makes himself small so you do not run him off. This one is quiet. He does not explain himself, and he sure does not make himself small. He makes himself useful, Clara said. And that is different. How is it different? A man who makes himself useful is a man who plans to stay. The words hung in the air. Clara thought of the firewood he had stacked so neatly. She thought of the perfect fire he built and how he understood what having only 2 logs left truly meant. You are only 12 years old, Clara said. How could you know all this? Hannah's needle stopped. She met her mother's gaze with eyes that were far too old for her face. Because that is what Daddy did the first time he came to Grandpa's house. He did not talk, he just fixed the porch rail and split a cord of wood. And then he waited. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She opened her mouth to argue, but the door flew open, letting in a blast of snow and cold. Eli stumbled in, his arms loaded with strips of pale white bark. The left side of his shirt was soaked through with blood. His face was a pale gray, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He went right to the stove, dropped the bark on the table, and started breaking it into pieces with hands that shook. A pot, he said, with boiling water. Clara got it for him. He dropped the bark in, and a bitter steam filled the cabin. It smelled like medicine, like someone was trying. Let it steep for 10 minutes, he told her. Any longer, and the girl will not be able to keep it down. How do you know this? I lost 40 head of cattle to a fever one winter. He suddenly sat down hard on the floor, his legs giving out. He pressed a hand to his side as fresh blood seeped out between his fingers. A man learns to make his own remedies when he cannot afford to lose what is his. 40 head of cattle. The words echoed in Clara's mind. A drifter did not own 40 head of cattle. She knelt down beside him. Let me see that wound. It is fine. It is bleeding all over my floor. Let me see it. He moved his hand. She pulled up his shirt and peeled back the bandage. The gash was torn wide open. You tore it open again. I figured I might. And you went out there anyway? He looked past her to where Ellie was shaking on the bed. Yes, I went anyway. Clara cleaned the wound and wrapped it again, pulling the bandage so tight he hissed through his teeth. She did not say sorry. You keep this up and you will get an infection, she said. Then I will have 2 people dying in my cabin. Nobody is dying here tonight. You do not get to make that choice. Neither do you, he said, his eyes locking with hers. But we can sure as heck fight it. Clara poured the willow tea into a cup and took it to Ellie. Drink this, baby. I know it tastes bad, but you have to drink. Ellie took a small sip, then coughed. Clara laid a hand on her daughter's forehead and just waited, praying without any words. Her son, Sam, sat by his sister. Is the medicine going to work? He asked. Across the room, Eli opened his eyes. It will work, he said, speaking directly to the boy. The fever will break by tonight, I promise. Sam nodded, satisfied with the man-to-man promise. He picked up his little hammer and went back to standing guard over his sister. Clara watched Eli as he watched her son. She saw something raw and painful in his face before he shut it away. Do not do that, Clara said quietly. Do not do what? Do not look at my boy like you are seeing a ghost. Eli's jaw tightened. I had a younger brother, he said, same age as your boy when I lost him. He did not say anything more, and she did not ask. Some doors stay closed for a reason. As the day wore on, Ellie's breathing started to ease up. The fever was still there, but it was not climbing. The tea was working. Eli sat by the fire and carved a piece of wood with a small, worn-out knife. Hannah watched his every move from the other side of the room. You know about cattle, Hannah said. It was not a question. Eli's knife stilled. A little. You said you lost 40 head. That is not a little. That is a herd. It was a long time ago. How long? Hannah, Clara warned. 12 years ago, Eli answered, looking right at the girl. It was a bad winter up in Montana. You want to know if I am a dangerous man? Hannah did not flinch. Are you? Not to y'all. That is not a no. No, he said, it is not. The honesty of his words filled the small cabin. "I have done things I am not proud of," Eli said, his voice low. "I have fought men, and I have made choices that cost people dearly. But I have never hurt a woman or a child, and I do not intend to start in a cabin where someone saved my life with her last piece of bread." Hannah held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to the shelf, and took down their tin of flour. She measured out enough for a few biscuits and began to mix the dough. "You can have 2, she said without looking at him. "The rest of us get 3. "What about you?" Eli asked. "I am not hungry." "Yes, you are. You gave your piece of bread to your brother last night when you thought your mama was not looking." Clara stared at her daughter. "You did what?" "He is growing. He needed it more," Hannah said, her face turning red. "Hannah Grace, you do not skip meals in this house." "What house, Mama?" Hannah's voice finally broke. "We have 6 weeks before Mr. Harrove takes it. We have no horse and no money. And there is a stranger bleeding on our floor who will not even tell us his last name." Her hands were shaking. "I am 12 years old, and I know exactly how many days of flour we have left if we stretch it. And I cannot stop counting. Because if I stop counting, I will start screaming." The room fell silent. Eli stood up, walked over, and gently took Hannah's hands out of the dough. He looked at Clara. "My last name is Harrove," he said. "The man coming to take your home is my father. He cast me out years ago for not being the ruthless man he wanted me to be. But the land is still half mine by law." A week later, when the elder Harrove showed up, he did not find a scared woman and her children. He found Eli waiting on the porch, calm and steady. They spoke for a long time. Voices were raised, but in the end the old man left, his face like thunder. He never came back. Eli stayed. He fixed the porch rail, chopped a winter's worth of wood, and taught Sam how to track. He helped Ellie get strong again. And he showed a family that was about to break that sometimes the stranger you help is the family you have been waiting for. They fought it, and they won. Them. Flour on both their fingers, warm and sticky. "I know," Clara whispered. "I know you are counting. I know you are scared. I am not scared. You are, and that is all right. I am scared, too." Hannah's face broke. "Not all the way, just a crack." Tears in her eyes that she blinked back hard. She pulled her hands free, went back to the dough, kept working it. "He still only gets 2 biscuits," she said. Clara almost laughed. Almost. That evening, the storm eased. The wind died to a whisper. Snow stopped falling for the first time in 4 days. The silence was sudden and total, like the world had taken a breath and was holding it. Ellie's fever broke at sundown. Clara felt it happen. One minute, the child's forehead was burning under her palm. The next minute, the heat started fading like coals going out. Ellie opened her eyes, clear eyes, present eyes, looked at Clara and said, "Mama, I am hungry." Clara pressed her face into Ellie's hair and breathed. Just breathed. Across the room, Eli watched. His face did that thing again, the raw thing he kept trying to hide. He looked down at the carving in his hands. Clara saw now what it was. A small horse. Simple but good. The legs were right. The proportions were right. A man who knew horses had carved this. He set it on the floor by the stove without a word. Sam found it an hour later, picked it up, turned it over in his hands, looked at Eli. "This is yours?" Sam asked. "It is yours if you want it?" Sam held the horse up to the firelight. Something in his face softened. The first soft thing Clara had seen there since Jim died. "My daddy used to carve," Sam said. "I know," Eli said, then caught himself. "I mean, good carvings come from men who pay attention. Your daddy must have paid attention." Sam put the horse in his pocket right next to the hammer. He did not say thank you. Did not need to. Just went back to bed and lay down with one hand on the hammer and one hand on the horse. Clara waited until the children were asleep. All 3 this time, even Hannah finally curled tight with her arms around Ellie, face slack and young in the firelight. She sat on the floor across from Eli, the fire between them. Low now, banked for the night, but steady. Enough light to see his face. "Show me the watch," she said. His whole body went still. The carving knife stopped. His eyes came up slow, found hers. What watch? The gold one you were holding last night when you thought I was sleeping. The silence stretched. The fire popped. A log shifted, sent sparks spiraling upward. Eli reached inside his shirt. His hand came out holding it. He set it on the floor between them. Firelight caught the metal and threw it back in a warm yellow glow. Heavy, thick gold case engraved on the back. Letters Clara could not read in the dim light. "Open it," Eli said. She picked it up. The weight surprised her, more than gold, something solid underneath, something that meant the watch was full case, not plated. She pressed the stem. The cover sprang open. Inside, the face was white, porcelain, Roman numerals, hands that still moved, still keeping time, despite the blizzard and the blood and the crawling through snow. A good watch, an expensive watch. A watch that cost more than Jim had earned in 5 years. On the inside of the cover, an inscription. She tilted it toward the firelight. ETB, build something worth keeping. She closed it, set it back between them. ETB, she said. Eli T. something. Beckett Blackwell. What does the B stand for? His face was unreadable. Firelight on one side, shadow on the other. He picked up the watch, held it in his palm. My father gave me this watch the day I turned 22. He said, told me to go build something worth keeping. It took me 16 years. Built it from nothing. 50 head to 4,000. 2 line shacks to a main house with 12 rooms. His hand closed around the watch. Then a man I trusted burned it all down, not with fire, with paper and lies, and a judge who owed him favors. Clara waited. I won it back. I won it. Every acre, every head. Courts ruled in my favor. He put the watch back inside his shirt. But I lost everything that mattered. Every friend, every ally, every person I thought cared about me turned out to care about what I had. So you left. So I left and came here. Did not mean to come here. Horse broke its leg 20 miles east. Had to put it down. Walked till I could not walk. Crawled till I could not crawl. He looked at her. Then a woman with a shotgun dragged me inside and gave me her last bread. Clara's chest hurt. I need you to tell me the truth. I am telling you the truth, the whole truth. Your name, where your money is, why you are really here. Clara, I have got 3 children and 6 weeks before I lose my home. I do not have time for half-truths and mystery. Either you trust me or you walk out that door when the storm clears and we forget each other. Eli looked at her across the dying fire at this woman who dragged him from the snow, bandaged his wound with her own petticoat, fed him bread her children needed, and now sat on a cold floor demanding the one thing he had been running from for 2 years. The truth. His hand went to his shirt where the watch rested against his chest. Not tonight, he said. But soon, I give you my word. Your word is not worth much when I do not even know your name. It is worth everything. You just do not know it yet. Clara stood, her knees ached from the cold floor. She looked down at him, at the blood seeping through his bandage, at the knife and the wood shavings and the place on the floor where the carved horse had been before Sam took it. Soon, she said, not later. Soon, soon. She went to bed, lay down beside her children. Ellie was cool now, breathing steady, the fever gone like it had never been. Hannah slept hard, exhausted from carrying the weight of a family at 12. Sam slept with the hammer in one hand and the carved horse in the other. Clara lay in the dark and listened to Eli settle on the floor, listened to his breathing slow, listened to the cabin creak in the cold. Somewhere in the night, she heard him say something, low, almost not there. She strained to catch it. Build something worth keeping. Then silence, then sleep, then nothing but the sound of the fire dying and the snow starting again, soft and steady, covering everything. The storm broke on the 5th morning. Clara opened the door and the world had gone white and still. Not a breath of wind, not a sound except the slow drip of ice melting off the porch roof. The sky hung low and gray, but the snow had stopped. Eli was already outside. He had been up before dawn every morning since the first night, Same pattern. Fire built, water hauled from the creek where he chopped a hole in the ice. Firewood stacked by the door. Clara had stopped pretending. She did not notice. Stopped pretending it did not matter. He was at the fence line now. The north section had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Posts snapped clean, wire buried. He was digging it out with his bare hands, pulling wire free, testing it for tension. His left side was still bound tight. She could see the bulk of the bandage through his shirt. He moved slower on that side, favored it, but he did not stop. 5 days. He had been here 5 days, and her fence was standing straighter than it had since Jim died. The firewood stack by the door was higher than she could reach. The chicken coop door that had been hanging crooked for a year swung smooth and true. The leak in the roof over Ellie's bed was patched with pine tar and bark. He did all of it without asking, without being asked, just saw what was broken and fixed it. Ellie was better. Not well, but better. The cough had turned dry, less frequent. She had eaten biscuits this morning, asked for more. Clara had given her Hannah's share, and Hannah had not argued, just gone outside to check the chickens with her jaw set the way it set when she was being brave about something. Clara pulled her shawl tight and walked to the fence line. Her boots crunched through the crust of ice on top of the snow. The cold was sharp, but clean. The kind of cold that felt honest after days of howling wind and darkness. Eli saw her coming, straightened up, wiped his hands on his pants. "The fence is worse than I thought," he said. "A quarter mile of it needs replacing. Posts are rotten at the base. Should have been swapped out 2 years ago. I know when they should have been swapped out." He looked at her. "I did not mean. I know what you did not mean. My husband was dying, and then he was dead, and then I was alone with 3 children, and 100 things that needed fixing, and 2 hands to fix them with." Eli nodded. Did not apologize again, did not fill the silence with empty words, just picked up the wire and went back to work. A few days later, Eli declared the storm was done and the road would be clear by morning. "I have to go to town for supplies," Clara said. "We are out of everything." "I will go with you," he offered. "No," she said firmly. "If people see me in town with a stranger, Harov will hear all about it." "He is going to hear about it anyway," Eli argued. "Your neighbors have seen smoke from your chimney all week. They will wonder where you got firewood." She had not thought of that. "I will go alone," she insisted. "I will face him like I always do, with my $18 and 5 weeks of time running out." "Let me help you," Eli said. "You are helping. You are fixing the fence. That is not what I mean." Clara faced him down. "I know exactly what you mean. You want to walk into town with that fancy gold watch of yours and pay off my debts." He met her gaze. "Would that be so terrible?" "Yes," she said, her voice as hard as the frozen ground. "That would make me beholden to you. I would be the helpless widow in debt to a man whose name I do not even know." Eli's jaw went tight. He looked away from her, then his eyes met hers again. "Beckett," he said. "Elijah Thornton Beckett." The name hung there in the freezing air. Clara waited for it to mean something, but it did not. "Beckett," she repeated. "My father was Colonel William Beckett. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the Montana Territory. 4,000 head of cattle, a 12-room ranch house, and 32 men on the payroll. He passed on when I was 22 and left it all to me." Eli picked up a piece of wire, twisting it in his hands. "I made it bigger. I doubled the herd, bought more land, and hired a partner, Marcus Crane, to handle the business side. And this Crane fellow betrayed you. He filed papers claiming I was unfit and dangerous. He tried to take everything. He told every important person from Montana to Fort Worth that I was a violent man who could not be trusted. Was any of it true?" The question was sharp, with no softness to it, the violent part. His voice turned flat. "Rustlers hit the ranch twice. The second time, they caught me by myself. I fought back, and 2 of them got hurt badly." He looked down at his own hands. "Crane used that against me. He said it proved I was dangerous. Did you win the fight?" "I won in court, but I lost everywhere else. My friends, my reputation, all of it." He dropped the wire. "So I sold the entire ranch. I gave my foreman a fair deal, signed the papers, and rode south. All I had was that watch and enough money in a Denver bank to buy a small town. Clara felt her breath catch. How much money? Enough. Tell me how much. $12,000. The number was so big it did not sound real. Clara's mind could not quite grasp it. 12,000. Her debt was $127. He could pay it off and not even notice the money was gone. You came to my cabin in a blizzard, she said, her voice low. Half dead, no horse, no coat, looking like you were broke. My horse broke its leg about 20 miles out. I had to put her down and just started walking. Why? Because I was searching for something. For what? For proof. His eyes locked with hers. Proof that someone in this world would help a stranger who had nothing. Not because of what they could get, but because it was the right thing to do. Clara stood frozen. The bitter cold bit at her face. Her hands ached. A hot, tight feeling grew in her chest, something between pure anger and understanding. You were testing me, yes. All this time, the firewood, the fence, you were seeing if I would help a poor man, even though I am poor myself. Yes, and the watch. You let me see it by the fire. You knew I was not asleep. He said nothing. He did not have to. His silence was the answer. Clara's hand moved before she even thought. Her open palm struck his face with a crack that broke the quiet. His head snapped to the side. A red mark started to form on his cheek. He just stood there and took it. I deserved that, he said. You deserve much worse, she said, her voice trembling. My daughter skipped meals so our flour would last. My son sleeps with a hammer because he is scared. My baby almost died from a fever just a few feet from where you were hiding a gold watch worth more than everything I own. I know. You know? She laughed, a broken, sharp sound. And that makes it all right? No, ma'am. Nothing makes it right. Then why? Why did you not just help? Why not just say you had money? Asked to pay my debts or buy medicine for my girl? Because every person who ever helped me wanted something in return. His voice cracked for the first time. Every smile, every handshake, it was always about the money, about what Elijah Beckett could do for them. When the money was gone, they all disappeared. He took a long breath. I needed to know if one person could just be decent, and I was your test subject. You were my last hope. Those words stopped her cold. She stood there, her hand still stinging, the cold air burning her lungs. She looked at this man who had built a kingdom, lost it, and then crawled through a blizzard just to see if a widow with $18 would share her last piece of bread. You are a fool, she said. Yes, ma'am. Do not call me ma'am. You are a fool, Eli Beckett. A rich, selfish fool who let my daughter go hungry to prove a point. I am. And if you think I will let you pay my debts out of guilt, you are wrong. It is not guilt. It is a partnership. Partnership? She spat the word. Equal partners, 50-50. Your land and your hard work against my money and cattle experience. We build something new together. I do not need a partner. You need $127 in 5 weeks. I will figure it out. How? By selling your mother's ring? The world went still and rigid. She had never told him about the ring. Her eyes flew to his face, searching for an answer. It is in the drawer by the bed, he said softly, wrapped in a handkerchief with lace edges. I saw it the second morning. You went through my things. The drawer was open. I saw it, but I did not touch it. That ring is all I have left of my mother. I know. You do not know a thing about her. I know she made that lace by hand. I know the ring is plain gold and worn down. I know you wrapped it in the finest thing she left you, which means it was everything to her. And now it is everything to you. Clara's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She had no more tears to give. Not for a rich man playing games on her land. I am going to town tomorrow, she said, alone. When I get back, you had better be gone. She turned and walked back to the cabin. Clara. She did not stop. I will be gone if you want. But first, let me at least leave enough to pay your debt. Just let me do this one thing right." She paused on the porch, her hand on the rail that Eli had fixed just 3 days ago. "That is not how this works," she said, her back still to him. "You do not get to lie to me and then just buy your forgiveness. Then tell me how it works." She went inside and shut the door behind her. Hannah was by the table. She had heard it all. "He is rich," Hannah said. "Yes. This whole time." "Yes. And he just watched us starve. He brought bark for Ellie. After watching us starve, Hannah's voice was like ice. He could have helped us from the very first minute. Instead, he just watched us, like we were some kind of test." Clara had no answer. Hannah was right. "I want him gone," Hannah said. "He will be gone tomorrow. I want him gone now, Mama. Now. Before Ellie gets any more attached to him. Before Sam—" She trailed off. Her gaze went to Sam's pocket, where a small carved horse had been for 3 days. His hand went to it whenever he was scared or lonely. "Oh," Hannah whispered, understanding something awful. "Sam already knows," Clara said, "and he does not care. That man made him a toy horse, and that is the first real gift that boy has gotten since his daddy died." Clara sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. The wood table was rough. Jim had made it. Years of scrubbing had worn it raw. Everything wears down eventually, she thought. "Mama?" Hannah's small, strong hand rested on her shoulder. "What are we going to do?" "I do not know, baby, but you always know." The peaceful quiet was shattered by 2 words from her daughter, Hannah. "Mama, riders." Clara looked out the window and her heart went cold. 2 men on horseback were coming up the road, slow and steady through the snow. She knew one of those horses. It was a big bay gelding that belonged to Judge Hargrove. A powerful man trying to take her land is an injustice we can all understand. This is a story about a woman who had nothing left to lose and found the strength to fight back. Stay with me to see how she did it. "Get away from the window," Clara ordered. "Take Ellie and Sam to the back corner and stay quiet." She grabbed the shotgun and the last 2 shells she had. The door opened, and it was Eli, the drifter she'd taken in. "2 riders," he said, his face grim. "I see 'em." His eyes locked on the shotgun. "Let me handle this," he said. "This is my place, Clara. My fight." She just looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped right up beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. "Your fight," he said, grabbing a hammer from a shelf. "But I'm standing here with you." The big man swung down from Hargrove's horse. It was his foreman, Burl Kendrick, 240 pounds of pure meanness. The other fella stayed on his horse, a long rifle resting across his saddle. Kendrick walked right up the path like he owned it. Clara stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held ready. Kendrick stopped 10 feet away, his eyes moving between Clara and Eli. He clearly hadn't counted on another man being there. "Mrs. Mallister," he said with a smirk. "Judge Hargrove sends his best. Just wanted to see if y'all were all right after the storm." "We're just fine," Clara said. "Good to hear," Kendrick replied, but his eyes were fixed on Eli. "Got company, I see. That's not your concern." "No, ma'am, it ain't," he said, reaching into his coat. Clara gripped the shotgun tighter. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "The judge wanted me to deliver this to you personally." Clara didn't budge. "Just set it on the gate post." Kendrick's smile was ugly. "No need to be unfriendly, Mrs. Mallister. The judge is just trying to help." He stared hard at Eli one last time, then walked back, left the paper on the post and rode off. Clara waited till they were gone before she went and got it. Her hands were steady, but her heart was hammering in her chest. She read the paper, her world tilting sideways. Eli came down from the porch. "What is it?" Clara's voice was flat, empty. "He moved the date up, the tax sale. It's not January 15th anymore. It's December 23rd. That was just 3 weeks away, the day before Christmas Eve." "He can't do that," Eli said, his voice hard. The law requires a 30-day notice. Clara just looked at him, surprised. You know about tax law? I know enough to see that Judge Hargrove thinks he is the law. She smoothed the legal notice flat. 3 weeks, it said, not 5. Hannah's voice cut through the quiet. 21 days, Mama? Clara squeezed her eyes shut. 21 days and only $18 in the coffee tin. Not nearly enough to stop a crooked judge who changed the rules just to be cruel. Eli sat across from her. Let me help. She shook her head. Clara, you have 3 weeks. I said no. He leaned in, his voice low. Is your pride worth more than your children's home? The words stung worse than a slap because they were true. Get out, she whispered. He didn't move. This isn't your fight. You are right, he said. It is yours. But I am making it mine. Not because you asked me to. He spoke of her little girl, Ellie, barely surviving a deadly fever. He mentioned her son, Sam, sleeping with a hammer for protection. He talked about 12-year-old Hannah skipping her own meals so her brother could eat. His voice grew rough. You aimed a shotgun at my chest, then dragged me inside and fed me bread you couldn't spare. That is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in 2 years. I will not stand by and let a man like Harov take this home from you. Not 3 days before Christmas. Clara pressed a fist to her mouth, forcing herself to breathe. From the corner, Sam's small voice piped up. Mama, let him help. Her boy stood there, hammer in one hand, a small wooden horse in the other. Daddy would have let him help. The cabin fell silent. Clara looked at the notice, at her children, then at Eli with his scarred hands and a look on his face she was just starting to trust. Partners, she said, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. Not charity. We are equal, or it is nothing. Equal, he agreed. My money for your land and all the sweat you have poured into this place. A fair trade. And you tell me everything. No more secrets. No more watching my family starve while you hide gold in your shirt. Everything. Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. And if you betray me, if you are just another man who lies, I will find you. And next time the shotgun will not be empty. Eli reached his hand across the table. It was the same hand that had carved a toy for her son. Clara took it, her grip firm. Hannah stepped forward and placed her small hand on top of theirs. I am watching you, she told Eli, her eyes wet but fierce. You hurt my mama, and I will not need a shotgun. Eli looked at the fiery girl and nodded. I believe you. Sam came last, putting his little hand on top of Hannah's. Partners, he said. Outside, the snow started falling again, covering the tracks Harov's men had left. Eli was gone before sunrise. Clara lay in bed, feeling a hollow space in her chest that she told herself was just hunger. He had taken a horse from town, paying with cash from a money belt she never knew he had. A belt full of money strapped to his body the whole time she was rationing flour and praying for a miracle. She got up and built a fire with the wood he had stacked. She boiled water from the bucket he had hauled. Every single comfort in her home now reminded her of him. Hannah watched her from the table. He is coming back. He said he would. Men say a lot of things, Hannah. Daddy said he would be back too. The words hung in the air. Clara knew her daughter was just scared. I do not want you to get hurt again, Mama. Clara put an arm around her. If he does not come back, we will figure it out just like we always do. And if he does, we will figure that out too. 3 days went by. Eli did not return. The first day, Clara fixed the fence herself until her hands bled and her back gave out. The second day, Agnes Whitmore, her 60-year-old neighbor, showed up with a basket of eggs and broth. Had a visitor, Agnes said, looking at the extra bedroll and the neatly stacked firewood. Had one, Clara answered. He is gone. Agnes checked on little Ellie. This child has been taking willow bark tea for her fever. I gave you the last of my willow bark a month ago, so someone found more for you. Clara finally told her everything. His name is Eli. I found him half dead in the blizzard. Agnes's face changed. Burl Kendrick has been telling everyone in the saloon that you have a man living here, and a stranger sent 4 telegrams from town yesterday. He paid with silver dollars. Kendrick works for Harrove, Clara whispered. Of course he told people. Clara explained it all. The watch, the money, the name Elijah Thornton Beckett. Agnes listened, her brow furrowed. Beckett, she said. I remember that name. His family owned the biggest cattle operation in Montana. Then the son just walked away from it all. Now he is here, fixing your fence. Clara felt a wave of despair. Real or not, Harrove moved the date up. 12 days, Agnes corrected her. You have 12 days until you lose your home, not 3 weeks. 12. Agnes stood to leave. I have watched Harrove ruin 6 families. If this Beckett man is who he says he is, and he is willing to put up a fight, you let him fight. Not just for you, but for all of us. 12 days. The new date was December 23rd. Clara sat at the table, numb. Sam came and stood beside her, pushing the little wooden horse toward the door. He is coming back, Mama. The horse knows. Horses always come home. On the 10th day, Eli returned. Clara was hauling water from the creek when she heard the hoofbeats. It was him riding one horse and leading another loaded with supplies. Behind him rode a second man, older, in a fine black coat that looked like it cost more than her whole homestead. Eli dismounted and closed the gate with the same care he had shown that first night. Clara set the heavy buckets down. She looked at him, feeling a storm of relief and anger rise in her chest. You were gone 10 days, she said, her voice tight. I know, he answered. You said it would be a few days. Things took longer than I expected. I brought some things back with me. What things? Eli motioned to a man on a third horse. Clara, this is Mr. Aldous Fletcher. He's a lawyer from Denver. The man tipped his hat. Ma'am, your partner here has told me all about your situation. My partner? Clara said, looking straight at Eli. Is that what we are now? We didn't agree on that before you vanished for 10 days, leaving me here with 3 children and just 12 days before I lose my home. Eli just stood there and took her anger, knowing she'd earned the right to it. The lawyer cleared his throat and they all went inside. He spread legal papers all over her small table. Mr. Beckett hired my firm 5 days ago, Fletcher explained. We filed an appeal with the territorial court. We also filed a complaint about some funny business with tax auctions in this county for the past 2 years. Clara looked at all the complicated words. What does that mean in plain English? It means, Fletcher said, adjusting his glasses, that Judge Hargrove is in a whole heap of trouble. Well, it turns out the fellow who reassessed your land was none other than the judge's own brother-in-law. He slapped a value on it 3 times higher than anything comparable. And you weren't the first. 5 other families in this county got the same treatment over the past 2 years. And every single one of them lost their land at auction to companies tied to the judge's bank. I know that part. Yes, ma'am. But what's news is that the territorial governor knows it now, too. My filing landed on his desk yesterday, along with a petition signed by 18 other folks who lost their land the same way. Clara's eyes shot up. 18? Mrs. Whitmore, Agnes, was a real force. That woman rode 30 miles in 2 days, rounding up signatures and sworn statements from old neighbors. Fletcher almost cracked a smile. She said to tell you, direct quote, this fight ain't just yours anymore. Clara felt a lump in her throat. Her hand trembled on the papers. What now, she asked. Now we take him to court. Not his court, ma'am. We're going to the territorial court in Denver, a judge he don't own. This emergency appeal freezes every tax action in this county. That means the auction set for December 23rd is dead in the water. It can't proceed. Clara whispered the words, letting them settle. You mean he can't sell my land? Not until a judge rules on the case, and that could take months. The relief washed over her so fast the world went blurry at the edges. She gripped the table to keep from falling. Eli put a hand on her shoulder. Steady. She shrugged it off. Don't. I'm fine. You're shaken. I said I'm fine. She walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the sharp, cold air. The land was still hers. Maybe it would stay that way. Eli followed, giving her space. "You should have told me," she said, "before you left. Should have told me about the lawyer, about Agnes. Would you have let me? That's not the point, it's the whole point. You'd have said no. You'd have called it charity. The very thing I told you I didn't want the day I showed up at your gate." She spun around to face him. "You think I don't know I need help? I've known it every single day for 2 long years. Every morning, the numbers don't add up, but I get up anyway. I feed my children, I fix what's broken, and pray over the rest, 'cause that's all I've got." Her voice broke, but she wrestled it back. "Don't you dare tell me I need help like it's some revelation. I know it better than you ever could. The difference is I've been living it while you were roaming the country feeling sorry for yourself 'cause your partners were snakes." The words hit him hard. She saw it in his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know I'm right. For 2 years I was just adrift. A damn fool looking for a sign. I know it. Then why'd you stop here? Because you pointed a shotgun at me, then brought me inside anyway." His voice dropped lower. "Because your little girl gave her bread to her brother, and your boy stood guard with a hammer. Because your baby was burning with fever, and you still made room for a stranger." He stepped closer. "I stopped looking for signs the day you slapped me. Everything since then has been real." "How do I know that?" "Because I rode through a blizzard to fetch a lawyer from Denver to fight a judge I've got no business with, all for a woman who just told me to my face she don't need my help." Clara looked at him, really looked at the man he was, scarred and weathered by a life that hadn't been kind. "I slapped you," she said, a faint memory. "You did, in front of my children." Hannah thought it was grand. A small sound, almost a laugh, escaped Clara's lips. She covered her mouth, but it slipped out anyway. "This ain't funny," she said, turning away. "No, ma'am. Stop calling me ma'am." "Clara." She took a breath and turned back. $12,000 in a Denver bank, yes. And you crawled through a blizzard carrying it. Put that way, it does sound a little foolish. It sounds crazy, that's also fair. She almost smiled again. "Partners, you said?" "I did. Equal? Equal. My land, your money. We build something together, split 50-50. That's the deal. And if we win against Hargrove, then we build." Eli looked out at her land, at the fences he'd already mended and the cabin that needed work. "We'll start with cattle in the spring. 30 head. Hire a couple of hands, build a proper barn." "With what money?" "I've got enough. More than enough." Clara leaned against the post, arms crossed. "And you stay?" "If you'll have me." "Doing what?" "Living on my porch." "I'll build a bunkhouse. Sleep there till we sort things out." He paused, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to offer, Clara. I'm asking to work. To build something worth keeping." His words from the watch echoed in her mind. "My children come first," she said, her voice firm. "Always. Before this ranch, before the money, before you. I wouldn't have it any other way. Hannah doesn't trust you. Hannah's a smart girl. And Sam lost his father. He's looking for something in you that you might not have to give." Eli was quiet for a long moment. "I know what he's looking for. I can't be his father. But I can be a man who shows up, who does what he says he'll do, and who don't leave. You already left once." "I came back." Eli met her eyes. "I will come back every time. That's a promise I don't make lightly. I've broken my share, but I won't break this one. Not to you." The door creaked open. Hannah stood there, her face telling them she'd heard every word. "Mr. Fletcher needs to go over the papers." Hannah's eyes fixed on Eli, hard and measuring. Then something in them eased, just a little. "He says Mama needs to sign 7 papers." "I'll be right there," Clara said. Hannah nodded, then looked at Eli one last time. "There's 2 biscuits left from this morning on the stove. You can have 'em." She disappeared back inside. Eli stared at the door. "Did she just offer me food?" "Don't make a big deal of it. Wouldn't dream of it." Inside, Fletcher laid out the documents, explaining each one simply. Clara signed her name 7 times, her hand shaking slightly. She hated how small her signature looked. Eli stood by, patient and quiet. When she was done, Fletcher packed his case. "I'll file these in Denver by the end of the week. The judge will get the news by courier." "He's going to be mad," Clara said. "Furious, most likely. Angry men do foolish things." Fletcher put on his coat. "That's exactly what we're counting on, Mrs. Mallister. Angry men make mistakes, and mistakes win cases." He tipped his hat and rode off. Clara watched him shrink against the snow until he was gone. "3 weeks ago, I was all alone," she murmured. Eli stood by the stove, holding a biscuit like it was a gold nugget. "You ain't alone anymore," he said. Then from the corner, a small voice, stronger than it had been in weeks. "Mama, I'm hungry." A real laugh bubbled up from deep inside Clara. She went to the shelf, took down Eli's good white flour, and started making more biscuits. Across the room, Sam was showing Eli a little wooden horse, his hands describing the saddle and barn it needed. Eli listened, really listened, the way he did everything, all in. Their heads were bent close together, planning. By the window, Hannah stood watch, her face set and her eyes sharp. She was ready for whatever was coming down that road. Clara worked the biscuit dough with strong, sure hands. It was what she did best, making something good out of almost nothing. Flour, water, and salt. Simple things, but they were enough. For the first time in weeks, a sliver of blue sky appeared out west. It wasn't much, but it was a promise that the sun was still there somewhere. She slid the biscuits into the oven and listened to the sounds of her little cabin. Her daughter stood watch, her son made plans, and the man she was just starting to trust was laughing softly with them. There were 12 days until the courthouse auction. 12 days until she would either lose everything or win it all back. She closed the oven door and felt the warmth on her face. She pushed a stray piece of hair from her eyes and got back to her work. The courthouse was freezing cold. Clara wore the same black dress she had worn to her husband's funeral. It smelled like cedar and sorrow. She tried to stop her hands from shaking. It was December 23rd, 9 in the morning. The court in Denver had put a stop to all tax auctions, but Judge Hargrove didn't seem to care one bit. 3 days ago, a notice went up on the courthouse door, plain as day. The auction was still on for December 23rd, 9 in the morning, sharp. He was selling off the Patterson place, Clara's land, and a couple of other family parcels. Hargrove was daring anyone to challenge him. Fletcher, the lawyer from Denver, had ridden hard for 2 days straight to bring Clara the official court order. He looked worn out, his spectacles smudged from the trail. He had told her, "This order is binding. If he sells that land, the sale means nothing." Clara knew better. "He's not trying to make it legal," she had said. "He's just trying to scare folks into giving up." Now she stood on the frozen dirt, staring up at the limestone courthouse. The air was cold and still. Her breath plumed in white clouds. A crowd was gathering, bigger than she expected. Maybe 40 people. She saw Agnes Whitmore, her chin held high like she was ready for a fight. Next to her were 2 women Clara hadn't seen in a long time. Widow Johnson and Mrs. Hendricks, who had both lost their land to Hargrove before. They had come back to see this through. Eli stood beside her, a silent presence. He wore a fine, dark wool suit with a gold watch chain across his vest. His boots were polished to a shine. He looked like a stranger, the powerful cattle baron Elijah Thornton Beckett, with his $12,000 and his Denver lawyer. He didn't belong to her world of fence posts and hungry children. She hated that suit. He asked, "Are you ready?" She wasn't, and neither was he. On her other side, her daughter Hannah stood tall. She was 12 years old, wearing a dress that was already too short in the sleeves and at the ankles. Before they left, her brother Sam had pressed a small wooden horse into her hand for good luck. She could feel its smooth shape in her pocket. The big courthouse door creaked open. Burl Kendrick, the judge's man, stepped out and scanned the crowd. His eyes landed on Clara, then on Eli. A sneer spread across his face. "Auction starts in 10 minutes, he barked. "Bidders up front." Fletcher started up the steps, carrying his leather case. He stopped right in front of Kendrick. "I need to speak with Judge Hargrove." Kendrick just shook his head. "The judge is busy." "I have an order from the territorial court," Fletcher said, his voice firm. "It suspends all tax sales in this county." Kendrick didn't budge. Fletcher held up the sealed envelope. "This is a certified copy. If the judge ignores this, he'll be in contempt of court. I suggest you give it to him." Kendrick glanced at the envelope, then passed Fletcher to where Eli stood watching. "You wait here," he grumbled, taking the envelope and disappearing inside. The crowd began to murmur. Agnes stepped closer to Clara. "We got 18 signatures," she whispered. "Every last one of them is here today. Folks who lost everything came all the way from Pueblo in Trinidad." Clara looked out at the faces in the crowd, people who had been ruined by the same man sitting inside that courthouse. "They came," she breathed. Agnes nodded. "This was never just about you, girl." The door opened again. Judge Hargrove himself stepped out into the cold morning air. He was a heavy man with a face full of veins that showed his temper. His eyes went straight to Clara, then to Eli, and then swept over the crowd. He held Fletcher's envelope in his hand, still sealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice practiced and loud, "I thank you for coming out in the cold. This auction will proceed as planned." Fletcher stepped forward again. "Judge Hargrove, I delivered a legal court order." "I received your piece of paper, Mr. Fletcher," Hargrove said, setting the unopened envelope on the railing, "and I'll give it all the consideration it deserves. This is a county matter handled by county laws. The territorial court has no say here." Fletcher tried to argue, but Hargrove cut him off. "You are not licensed to practice in this county, sir. This auction is proceeding." The clerk, a thin man with a reedy voice, unrolled a scroll. "First parcel, the Mallister property, 160 acres. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the small wooden horse in her pocket until it hurt. "Do I hear an opening bid?" the clerk asked. $50, Kendrick called from the top of the steps, bidding for the judge as always. Clara looked at Eli. He was watching Hargrove, his face completely calm like a man doing sums in his head. "Do I hear 60? $150. The voice was Eli's, clear and steady. Every single head in that crowd turned to look at him. Hargrove's jaw went tight. "Who is the bidder?" the clerk stammered. Eli walked up the steps, slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of the clerk. "Elijah Thornton Beckett, of the Beckett Cattle Company." He handed the man a business card. "I am bidding on behalf of Mrs. Clara Mallister, the rightful owner. $150 to clear all her debts, including the banknote held by First National." The clerk's hands began to tremble as he read the card. Hargrove stepped. "This auction is for tax debt only." "And that debt is held by your bank, Judge," Eli said, his voice perfectly level. "The same bank that holds a controlling interest for you." "The same bank," Eli continued, "that has bought every foreclosed property in this county for the last 2 years, using shell companies tied to your own family." The mood of the crowd shifted, turning sharp and angry. "You are out of order, sir." Hargrove's face was turning a dark, blotchy red. "I am a bidder at a public auction," Eli replied calmly. "I am perfectly in order." He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick stack of cash, and counted it out for everyone to see. $150. Mrs. Mallister's debts are paid. This auction is void. "This auction is not void until I say so," Hargrove roared. "Not according to territorial law," Eli said, "which you should know, seeing as you graduated 3rd in your class from law school in St. Louis. I checked." Hargrove's mouth snapped shut. "I also checked the tax rolls," Eli went on, pulling out another set of papers. "Your ranch was assessed at $1.25 per acre, while Mallister's land was assessed at $4 an acre. The widow Johnson's land at $3.75. Your own brother-in-law did every single one of those assessments. He let the papers fall open. Every property was won at auction by a bidder connected to your bank. And every parcel was then signed over to a company called the Western Progress Land Trust. Eli paused, letting the silence hang in the cold air. Which, as it happens, is registered in your wife's name. The courthouse steps went dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. Hargrove grabbed the railing, his knuckles turning white. These are baseless lies from an outsider. They are documented facts, Eli said, placing his papers right next to the judge's unopened court order. And they have been filed with the territorial court, the state land office, and the governor. The territorial marshal is in town, Judge. He got in last night. He is having his breakfast at the hotel right now, and he is very eager to discuss these documents with you. All the color drained from Hargrove's face. He looked like a ghost. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape. You are bluffing, he whispered. I don't bluff, Eli said, stepping closer. His voice dropped low, just for the judge to hear. I spent 16 years in the cattle business. A man who bluffs in that business ends up losing his entire herd. Walk away from this auction, Judge. Resign. My lawyers won't push for prison time. That's the best deal you're going to get. Hargrove just stared, the fight completely gone from his eyes. Hargrove stared at Eli, the full, terrible truth slowly dawning on him. You have no idea what you've done, the judge whispered, his voice trembling with rage. Oh, I know exactly what I've done, Eli said calmly. I did the same thing Mrs. Mallister did when she aimed her shotgun at a stranger in a storm. I chose which side I was standing on. Hargrove looked past Eli to Clara standing there in her funeral dress, with a whole crowd of people he'd cheated standing right behind her. This isn't over, he snarled. For you, it is. Hargrove turned and walked back inside the courthouse, his empire crumbling around him. The clerk stood alone on the steps holding a stack of papers. His voice cracked as he announced, "The auction is suspended. All tax sales in this county are frozen, pending a territorial review." A raw, powerful sound went through the crowd. Folks were crying and throwing their hats in the air. Clara just stood there, her legs feeling like water. Eli came down the steps and stood in front of her. He looked tired, but he was smiling. It's settled, Eli said, using the money he had tucked away. Clara could not find her words. She tried again, her voice a whisper. You just stood up to a judge for the whole town to see. Eli glanced at the folks gathered around, Agnes, the widow Johnson, and so many others. They were people who had lost nearly everything but came back to fight alongside her. For all of us, he corrected. Hannah stepped up from behind her mother, her face a blank slate. She looked Eli square in the eye and held out her hand. He took it, and they shook once, firm and businesslike. You still only get 2 biscuits, Hannah stated plainly. A slow smile spread across Eli's face, the kind a man gets when a weight he has carried for years is finally lifted. Yes, ma'am, he said. On the quiet ride home, their horses cut dark trails in the fresh snow. Clara saw 2 sets of tracks, where for 3 long years there had been only one. They rode without many words. The quiet between them was different now, a comfortable silence between 2 souls who had faced a storm together. When they topped the rise, the cabin stood there, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The fence Eli had mended stood tall. Before they even reached the gate, little Sam came tearing out, yelling in his sock feet. Mama, Ellie ate 3 biscuits. Clara swung down and scooped him up, his cold nose pressing into her cheek as he wrapped his arms around her neck. 3 whole biscuits? She asked with a smile. Inside, Ellie sat up in bed, her cheeks rosy and her eyes shining bright. Clara hugged her tight, breathing in the simple warm scent of her healthy child. That feeling was better than any victory in town. Hannah walked past them to the stove and began unpacking the new supplies. For the first time in ages, Hannah's face seemed at peace as she worked. Eli lingered in the doorway, halfway in and halfway out, just waiting. You are letting the cold in, Clara said gently over Ellie's hair. He stepped inside and shut the door. That night, for the first time, 5 of them sat down for supper. There were fresh biscuits and gravy, and the coffee was good and strong. Clara saw that Hannah had set 5 places at the table without a word. After the children were put to bed, Clara found Eli on the porch. He was sitting in the second chair, the one he had fixed himself. She sat in the other, and they rocked in the quiet, the runners of the chairs creaking on the wood. The sky above was finally clear. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and snow. "Fletcher says the court case could take 6 months," Eli said. "Might get ugly." Clara just nodded. "I can wait." They fell silent, their rocking chairs nearly touching. "Come spring," Eli began, "I'm thinking of bringing up 30 head of cattle from Denver." They started planning, talking about grass and when to build a barn, just like they had that first night. But this time it felt real. "Eli," Clara said, "that watch of yours, the writing on it." He pulled the gold watch from his shirt. "Build something worth keeping. Those were my father's words." He paused. He was talking about a cattle business. But I reckon he really meant you should build a life around whatever you are most afraid of losing. Clara thought about that. "For the longest time," she said softly, "that was this place, this land." She looked at him then, really looked at the man sitting beside her. "Now," she said, "I have more to be afraid of, which just means I have more that is worth keeping." His hand reached across the small space and covered hers. It was calloused and warm. She let it rest there. From inside, Sam's sleepy voice called out, "Mama, the little horse needs a name. Can I name him Eli?" Clara glanced at Eli and saw that open, vulnerable look he got around her children. "You can name him whatever you want, sweet boy," she answered. "His name is Eli," Sam mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. Eli's hand tightened on hers just a little. "I am not going anywhere, Clara," he said quietly, but with a firmness that settled deep in her bones. "I know," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "This is where I want to be." She looked out at their land, the fence standing strong under a blanket of white. It was like the snow gave the whole world a fresh start. "Then stay," she said simply. And so they sat, 2 people on a porch, holding hands while their children slept safe inside a home that was finally, truly theirs. Tomorrow would bring work and worries, a future to be built from scratch. But tonight there was just the quiet, and stars so bright they looked like flowers spilled across a dark sky. For the first time in 3 years, her breath did not hurt. A story like this sticks with you, does it not? Maybe you have been Clara, giving what you could not spare. Or maybe you have been Eli, walled off and afraid to trust. Maybe you were Hannah, just 12 years old and carrying the weight of the world. Or maybe you were Sam, holding a wooden horse, just wanting someone to stay for good. We have all wondered if being kind in a hard world is foolish. This story does not give easy answers. It just reminds us that sometimes the most important thing is to have someone sitting there with you in the dark. Thank you for listening. And if you have ever been the person to give that last piece of bread, or the stranger who received it, I hope you know it mattered. It always does. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.